Okay, so our last session of this two-day conference, I'm really appreciative to everybody who has presented over this past 2 days. It's really exceeded my expectations. I guess I should say have high goals and low expectations is my philosophy here. But Ginny leads the customer engagement and experience strategy at AIP Publishing, where she leads a team that partners with marketing and technology stakeholders to engage researchers and provide a frictionless author experience. Prior to joining AIP Publishing, Ginny worked at Frontiers, Taylor and Francis, and the American Economic Association for customer engagement, product management, and editorial capacities. She served on several committees at the Council of Science Editors, Society for Scholarly Publishing, and Force One. She's based in Pittsburgh and is currently pursuing an MBA at Carnegie Mellon University. Congratulations. Why don't you go ahead and introduce Andrew and your topic from funding to publication?
Absolutely. So actually, I'm going to immediately hand it over to Andrew, both to introduce himself and to introduce the topic. Andrew will describe this much better than I'm about to, but he is a policy whiz. I am more well-versed in the editorial side. So I'm just going to hand it off to him to start. And before I do that, is everyone seeing the slides and not some kind of weird version of my shared PowerPoint deck? Awesome. All right, off to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Ginny. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to spend with us today. I know it's Friday, it's the end of the week, and you've all been working really hard at a conference. So we'll try to make this one quick, but we're covering a very heavy topic. We're going to talk today about the impact of the geopolitical landscape on scholarly communication. So my name is Andrew Bostjancic. I work at Taylor and Francis. And so my day-to-day work is I work in the policy and external affairs side of things. So essentially, I work with governments across the globe to help them understand scholarly communication and the impacts that their policies have on our industry. So today we kind of wanted to talk through what some of that looks like, particularly in some more dire areas across the globe, and how we as publishers can be providing best practices. And so one of the ways that we're going to focus on today's topic is we're going to do kind of a composite hypothetical researcher and kind of tell their story of like what it looks like when they get into a geopolitical conflict in their country. So when we look at what we're going to be kind of focusing on the next slide, we really want to cover kind of those overarching trends, what is happening and what is the impact to scholarship, scholarly communication. When there is geopolitical issues, what does that look like for us? We've seen it in the news, what it can look like for healthcare, what it looks like for humanitarian efforts, what it looks like on the war front. But we sometimes forget that there is actually a big impact in a lot of researchers that are greatly impacted when their countries decide outside of their own desires possibly or whatever they're thinking about, that when their country decides to make a choice, that greatly impacts their research and how they interact with our communities. And then we'll wrap up here with some best practices and guidance for navigating some of these challenges and things that you can be thinking about at your own organizations or things to consider taking on as your own. And I will say there's a little note here. So Ginny and I, we're talking a very big topic. And so we'll say this now, all the views expressed here are our own. They do not represent either of our organizations, but these are things that her and I have talked about when we're sitting around and having conversations. We usually get into some of these bigger topics, and we thought it'd be a great one to kind of address here today. So we'll jump right into our hypothetical. So we have Dr. Orlova. She's a senior researcher at the Institute of Molecular Biology in Moscow. Her focus is studying genetics, plant resistance to climate change, and she's really become a lover of science and really trying to help solve global food insecurity, which is her passion. So that kind of sets up, we have somebody who is focusing on their love of science. They're not necessarily linked into their country's political scene, but we do see that quickly when things go wrong, that can have a great impact on her. So we'll see here on the next slide. Super ambitious. So for her work, she, like we mentioned, she's looking on genetically engineering crops to be more resilient against the shifting climate change. And so she is one of those top researchers that, it's really great to work with. She has international collaborators from US to Europe, is really working across the globe to make her research, more broad to a wider audience. She's publishing in prestigious international journals. She's volunteering on editorial boards. She's doing all of these great things that we see that we love to see out of researchers. And a lot of her work is funded through global philanthropic groups that are located outside of her country. Again, her career is taking place in the backdrop of shifting geopolitical landscape. So we all live in, I'm guessing primarily the group here might be US based. I also went to a GW alum. So you're on the backdrop of Washington. So you kind of know that there are a lot of political conflicts and geopolitical conflicts happening every single day. And so what does that mean when you look at when you're a researcher? That could mean a quick decline in international collaboration. There can be challenges in higher education mobility for students coming into educational areas because their country is being sanctioned. There becomes a new publishing center where organizations are looking at having countries are looking at having their global education centers more focus in internally and making sure that that predatory journals that are trying to utilize this new threat can kind of come into this space. And they see this as kind of an opportunity to try to not attack, but they try to encourage researchers to utilize these regions as a way to publish in journals where they can no longer get access to for various reasons. So they see this as the tensions growing, that this is an opportunity to kind of infiltrate kind of these more vulnerable areas. So here on the next slide, we kind of want to dive really into like what is going to happen when war strikes. So when we're looking at this, they're facing a whole host of various issues, from political isolation and sanctions. So now as a researcher, it's much more challenging to get resources into your country from collaborators that you may have been working with previously. There becomes a strain between them due to the political tensions. Other researchers may have fear of associations with the researcher. There's certainly visa and travel restrictions for her. So now she's no longer able to enter certain countries, to travel to conferences. Depending on where her research may take her, she can no longer get to some of these areas. There's certainly communication barriers where if you're being cut off or there's a heightened scrutiny, either internally from your own government, who is now much more cautious of who's communicating with who outside of their borders. That's one area. And then communications going into other countries can also be much more scrutinized. Censorship becomes another issue with governing bodies who are much more cautious of what is happening within their country. So you may be self-censoring where you're not necessarily wanting to have your work pushed out in the same ways, or you're much more cautious of what you will say, particularly if it takes a approach that has some sort of political leaning one way or another, or could be interpreted that way. So you're going to be much more cautious in those things. You'll see a decline in institutional support. So when a nation goes to war, their resources are going to be shifting from perhaps research and development into more war-based efforts. So we'll kind of see that in those cases, they're going to shift into putting more support into war efforts, possibly to food and building up military efforts. And that ends up leading to a decline in maybe your research and the grants you were receiving. You do kind of reach this place when it comes to ethical and moral dilemmas where you as a researcher might be wondering how to best interact with your community and what feels right. And if you're now trying to work with Dr. Orlova, and you were working with her, and all of a sudden there's this dilemma of where her country's gone to war, and you may be against that war. How do you interact with somebody that's in that seat where they may not be directly working with the government, but there is an issue with folks that living in those countries? So there is some pressure to figure out ethically and morally, how do you kind of manage that as a researcher? And then there's a push internally to be publishing more locally. So this is that kind of power vacuum that kind of happens where there's this sense of nationalism where countries may come in and be pushing for more pride in the work in the country. And so there might be more pressure to publish locally, which again, depending on the infrastructure of journals, depending on the infrastructure of the research community, that can become a great challenge for folks. And so, but they do feel that pressure of wanting to not upset maybe their country, and they may see that as contributing to as patriotic in some ways. Obviously, there's concerns over data privacy and what's going to happen with your data that you've been working on. Are there more issues with that getting out? Again, it's in that communication realm, which is another primary issue where there could be a lot of reputation damage that could happen if your research is happening, where the data is getting out, or the research structures are being kind of violated as well. And again, in the collaboration, you might, as a collaborator with Dr. Orlova, you might see yourself as saying like, well, do I really want to be seen with this person? Is this going to have a reputation damage in my community? Will my institution look at this negatively? So you're really working through a lot of these various difficult questions and trying to figure out how do you best navigate them as a researcher outside of a war-torn country and within one. And it's a very challenging issue to kind of navigate between the two.
All right, great. Thanks, Andrew. And as a side note, I am seeing that my Canvas slides did not do very well when turned into PowerPoint. So if you're watching this, wondering what bozo put these slides together, this is that bozo, and sorry about that. So Andrew has talked a little bit about the general landscape that researchers are working in when they're in a country that is experiencing some sort of hostility with other countries, or it's in some sort of conflict. But a lot of us here are publishers. We're at the GW publishing conference. So we're going to get even more specific and talk about what challenges Dr. Orlova might face, not just during the research lifecycle, but in the publishing process specifically. So when submitting her research to journals, Dr. Orlova is likely to face two primary issues. First, editorial bias. There have been public cases where editors have said that they will not accept work from researchers who are at an institution located in a specific geography because of ongoing conflict. And two, sanctions. So when governments issue sanctions against other countries that prevent their citizens from accepting payments from those countries, it typically means that publishers that are based in the countries that have issued a sanction are unable to accept article publishing charges or anything else like page charges or anything that you might be charging authors from authors that are in those areas. So for example, at AIPP, as a US-based publisher, we are not able to accept APC payments from researchers in countries such as Russia and Iran because of the US sanctions. So what does COPE say about this? Does COPE weigh in on Dr. Orlova's situations? In some ways, COPE is actually very clear about their stance here. So COPE says that decisions should be based solely on the scientific merit of a manuscript, not on characteristics of the authors. More broadly, within all of COPE's guidance, COPE advocates for fairness and transparency in editorial policies, which would also apply here. And they also encourage training for journal editors on topics such as unconscious bias. And just to be clear, I realize that unconscious bias is a little bit different than what we're talking about here. But I think that mentioning it is still worthwhile because there's some relevance to the topic at hand. So on one hand, I think that COPE is clearer here in its guidance than it is in some other areas. So from an editorial bias perspective, I think it's really clear that COPE is saying that they do not support journals having policies against editing and peer reviewing manuscripts. Except about not peer reviewing and editing manuscripts from authors that are in a specific region or associated with a specific institution. However, from a sanction perspective, their policy specifically says that, quote, decisions to edit and publish should not be determined by the policies of governments or other agencies outside of the journal itself, except where a decision might place the journal in violation of applicable law. But we know that in the case of APCs, willingness and ability to pay is often a prerequisite to having your work reviewed. So even if we were talking about this just more broadly than geopolitical conflicts, I think a lot of us have some kind of language when authors are submitting that asks if they're able to pay the APC or that they confirm that there will be an APC that's charged if their manuscript's accepted. So in this case, it's a little bit more of a gray area. And in many cases, you see publishers responding to this by saying that authors from countries where there are sanctions that prevent payments for APCs are more than welcome to submit their work to subscription journals, but that they're unable to be published in open access journals unless there's already another form of waiver that would apply to them. So in some cases, for example, I think Iran, where there are sanctions, the countries already would be, people from that country would already be subject to waiver policies that would allow them to publish for free. So in those cases, a lot of publishers, you see them saying that that still applies, even if the reason that they're not able to pay is legal because of the sanctions. But in the case of Russia, for example, which often doesn't fall under those policies that publishers have, we don't see that. So that's that, right? We know that Dr. Orlova might not be able to publish open access in any journal, but she can probably still publish open access in some journals, and she can still publish freely in any journal where she doesn't have to pay an APC because COPE says so, right? So not quite. Her actual experience is really going to differ based on the specific journal that she submits to. An article came out in Science in 2022 following Russia's invasion of Ukraine about calls to boycott manuscripts from Russian institutions. And the reactions described in that article and in some other related pieces that came out right around the same time were somewhat mixed. So Carolyn Sennen from STM, and who previously worked with Andrew, I think at TNF, reported that STM did not know of any publishers that were considering turning away Russian authors or authors from Russian institutions. And while they did indicate that they knew of some publishers who were having internal conversations about how to handle the conflict more generally, they didn't know of any policy changes that had been made as a result. The editor-in-chief of Physical Review C was also quoted, and he said that while he empathized with the Ukrainians, he planned to follow the publisher's anti-discrimination policy and didn't believe that this was any sort of security risk. And then on the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum, the editors of the Journal of Molecular Structure announced that they would not be peer reviewing manuscripts submitted by authors based at Russian institutions. And they clarified that it wasn't specifically about the author's country of origin. So an author could still be from Russia. They would still peer review that work, but they specifically would not peer review work that was from authors that were affiliated with an institution in Russia. So in that case, Dr. Orlova would not have her work reviewed at the journal. The editor shared this with Retraction Watch, and they had like a really long piece explaining their viewpoint and the fact that this was temporary. So if you're interested, Retraction Watch has a very long piece on it there. So if we take a step back from our semi-fictional story here on Dr. Orlova, and we consider the heterogeneity and the responses of journals to the Russian invasion and how they're handling Russian manuscripts, I think that what's notable here is that regardless of the decision that journals are making, we were, one, generally hearing from journal editors rather than publishers on those decisions. And in fact, some publisher websites that have, editorial guidance for editors on myriad topics specifically just tells editors to get in touch with their publisher representative if they have questions about it, instead of actually directly talking about their policy on their website like they do other policies. And two, we're seeing people being really thoughtful here and making decisions based on what they think is best for science and humanity more broadly. So while COPE's statement is relatively cut and dry, other than in the case of sanctions, and it doesn't leave a ton of room for variation, I think what we're seeing on a day-to-day level is much more nuanced and gray. So if you are a publisher in the virtual room with us today, what are you supposed to do? So far, we have told you how challenging this is, and that actually researchers aren't just thinking about their research, but they have to think about all of the conflict going on around them and how that impacts their international collaborations and their funding, and maybe they'll get rejected because of it. But we haven't actually given you any ideas for what you can do with this information to make it usable. And considering you signed up for a conference, I have a feeling that you are hoping for something a little bit more applied than it's complicated. Unfortunately, I am not going to have like a satisfying, this is exactly what you should do answer, because I think that the underlying message to all of this is that it's really complicated and there's a lot going on. But we will give you something. So one, have a clear editorial policy here. Even if it's not something that you want to post on your website, I think that the biggest takeaway, like I said, is that this is really sticky and that there are a lot of really reasonable stances that people have thought about a lot. So for that reason, taking the time to really think about how your organization should respond is worthwhile. And as much as you can, try to communicate this with affected stakeholders, particularly editors, because not only are editors where most editorial policies end up living or dying just in general, but as you can see from like the science article that I mentioned, the people that were interviewed were editors. So editors are the ones not only handling papers and on the front lines, but they're really the ones that are in many cases being asked about this very publicly, even if you might have the feeling like, well, this is really more of a publisher policy. Even if it is, editors may be asked questions about it and they may have to answer to that. Secondly, if you do follow COPE's guidance and you don't want an author's institutional affiliation to impact peer review, it might be another reason to consider double anonymous peer review. Now, I realize that changing your entire peer review model just because of the international conflict is probably not an advisable decision. You probably want to put a lot more thought into it than that. But I think right now, we're using the example of Russia, but there's lots of international conflict and there's lots of cases where, someone might be invited to review a manuscript where there are like hostile relations between the author's country and or the author's institution, and where like the reviewer is located. So if this does feel like it's maybe relevant to your context based on what your authorship looks like and the geographic makeup of it, it might be like another reason to consider thinking about double anonymous peer review. And lastly, enable your editors and ensure you're aligned through including this topic in editor training. Like I've said repeatedly, I think the TLDR, the too long didn't read, of this presentation is that it's a really complex, tricky topic. It's really big. There's a lot to it. So it's important to ensure that your editors are well equipped to navigate it. And with that, we will turn it over to you. I think we have 8 minutes until 4 p.m. If you have any questions, we would love to hear them.
Thank you all for your presentation. I feel like we've come full circle. We started the day having this really involved conversation about peer review and double-blind peer review and sort of the ethical considerations about bias and authorship and the relationship between the reviewer and the work. And so I appreciate that we've kind of revisited this concept with a different scenario and a different set of constraints that shape how we approach it. And so I appreciate like the symmetry of it, and that you guys have given us a really wonderful example, a really tangible example to consider the implications of all of this.
I love that too. It's funny because before this, I was thinking to myself about how like I had included something about how COPE also talks about unconscious bias at training for editors. And I thought, is that maybe like irrelevant? Like maybe I shouldn't be including that in this presentation because some of the instances we cover in our example of publishers are like, that's not unconscious bias. That's like editorial board saying we will not review this work. So very different. But the more I thought about it, I thought like, well, we're using one example and we saw a lot of people talking about it after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but conflict between countries has happened forever and is very likely something that can contribute to things like unconscious bias. So yeah, I think that I similarly in making the presentation had a little bit of a like, wow, that's a good, I should think about that more epiphany.
I definitely appreciate it. My own graduate work was in international affairs, international management, and kind of international public policy. And honestly, it's something that comes up all the time in publishing careers. In my career, at least, it's been a big part of it. So we are getting some good questions now, finally in the Q&A. Thanks, everybody. We'll start with hopefully I can pronounce your name, Jihan. Where can we get more information about crafting an editorial policy?
Ooh, this is a good question. And I'm going to give you a really inconclusive answer, and I'm sorry in advance for that. But when we were putting this presentation together, I'm also going to give you a long-winded one. So I'll stop apologizing and just answer the question. So when we were researching this presentation, I initially thought, why don't I just like compile a lot of the different approaches publishers have taken so that if you wanted to be able to create an editorial policy, you could use like a version of what a publisher has. So I found the COPE page and like I said, the COPE is really pretty clear about it. I think sanctions are the one area where there's like a little bit of gray space, but if you look at like Springer Nature, for example, they really just say like, we follow COPE, we do what COPE does, look at COPE and then quote it a little bit. Most of the other publishers that I found really don't put much on their website about it. And Andrew, you almost certainly know TNF's policy much more than me, so you can speak to that. But I think that I got the impression that, I know from working at different publishers, a lot of them have some internal policies on this, but that maybe it's purposely not something they're super open about on their website, because it is like such a sticky it's such a sticky area, and there's so many like reasonable positions you can take. So I would say that beyond COPE's guidance and beyond just doing more digging into other societies and publishers that tend to operate a lot with like a similar authorship base as you, so that you're doing something that's sort of community aligned, it might be good to talk to people that you meet at conferences like this one, or that you already know about how they're like as a publisher, how they navigate this. Because yeah, like I said, I think there's way less online than there usually is about stuff like this. And I think that's probably by design, because you do see other information on things like the response to Ukraine. So I think talking to people and getting a feel for like what the policy looks like behind the scenes and how they kind of navigate it as it comes up is probably a really good place to start. Andrew, do you have anything to add to that?
I just dropped in TNF. I just dropped in our publishing ethics for journal editors, like an FAQ for folks to kind of dig through. So there might be some pieces there, but again, like when it comes to sanctioned countries, we have certain legal obligations that we can and can't follow when it comes to doing like APC transactions. So it does kind of bind us a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some resources around just in general, and editorial policy it's for library publishing, but the library publishing curriculum I mentioned in the chat has some things about crafting editorial policies, and it's something we talk about a lot in our publishing program. Let's see, we had a couple other questions. Oh, this is a good one. An anonymous attendee. How to handle an individual colleague who goes rogue and exercises their bias against policy and against this guidance, not immediately navigating an HR situation, but how to bring them into conversation. That sounds like a
Great
challenging one.
Andrew, if at any point you're like, Ginny, stop just jumping in, feel free to interrupt me. I think I have like a two-pronged answer to this though. Like the first part is that I think that this is part of why being proactive, even though being proactive requires like doing the aforementioned work of like trying to figure out what other norms are in this, even though it's not openly online. I think this is why being proactive is so important, because like with a lot of things, like anyone that has done a lot of like editor management knows that so often a big part of your job ends up being like working with the editors that you have relationships with to help them sort of come with you when you're trying to implement something, or when your organization believes a policy is really important. And I think in this case particularly, like everything I've read about this are from people that are thinking about it like really deeply. So I imagine that if your organization has or is going to have like some kind of policy on this, it'll be one that people have thought through really closely and that they feel really strongly about in terms of like how it'll help, or how it'll help the greater scientific community. So I think talking to your journal editors about it, like on the front end and before they, even would have the opportunity to go rogue, one ensures that they know you have a policy, because so often like editors don't even necessarily know that you have a policy, even if, especially with like something like this, where it's something that's sort of emerging, they might just not know. And two, that way, like when you're talking to them about it, you can talk them through how you came to the policy that you had and kind of get them on board, instead of just saying like, no, you can't do that. If it does actually happen, this is a very specific answer to, I think the answer really is in my mind has more to do with like how you typically deal with like editors that go rogue and do things that aren't in line with your editorial policies. My own view personally is that if it's again, as John said in the chat, again, COPE, my own view personally is that if it's really egregious, like they're representatives of your journal, they're like the ones that are not just representatives, but are like the thing that stands between someone being published and not being published. And if they are openly doing something that's egregiously against your editorial policies, I think that it might be time for them to part ways. But I think every organization kind of has their own way of dealing with that. And it tends to really depend on the specific case. Andrew, do you have anything else to add there?
I mean, I think you kind of hit on the key piece. I mean, the only other thing I would add is trying to get to having, if you're going to have a conversation with them, try to get to the core of why they feel that way, and understanding too, then like Ginny was saying, point to the policy, work through, like, do they have an issue with that? Is there a way to work through this? Is there a way to either steer them away from having to work in this space, depending on what the colleague's role is, or as Ginny said, if there is kind of a butting of heads and there is no issue, then you may want to just go to HR and kind of let them handle it with their professionalism.
Okay, well, let's see. Ginny had to go. No problem, Ginny. We'll thank you later. Let's have one other question here from Catherine. This is a fascinating topic. I'm curious, who is your target audience for this research about the impact on authors, researchers beyond editors and publishers? Do you share this data with government agencies or academics themselves? And what is the general reaction to it?
So for us, this, we haven't really dug into any type of like full on research. Like, I think we would actually have to get a little bit more granular with it. We were more looking at the topic as a high level topic of something that our organizations are dealing with. And it just seemed really interesting to us. And so we wanted to dive in a little bit across kind of a lit review of what's going on with other publishers, what other folks are doing in this space. But it would be more interesting to kind of get in there and figure out, like, what does this look like? I mean, in the target audience, I think would be editors as being a key one, so that they have a better understanding of like what a researcher might be going through. I think even, to the question's point, like, you can even echo it to government agencies, so they have a better understanding of what does this look like when they might be negotiating with foreign governments. Are these just researchers who are in their own field trying their best, and we're trying to say, like, they still need a way to work with us in this community for this bigger topic. So that would be another potential audience as well. But it's a really interesting question. Hopefully we can dig more into it over time.
Well, I know a lot of associations like AAP in particular, but AU Presses, certainly SSP, and many others have kind of government relations, and certainly a lot of big publishers. I mean, Andrew, you work in this in like government relations and stuff. So a lot of bigger publishers have these kind of smaller publishers aren't going to be able to necessarily have government relations like that, but Great panel, great topic. Thank you so much. I want to mention a few things just to close this conference. Thank you all for attending. We still have several people online. I want to thank Pooja in particular for her work in helping to organize this. As she mentioned yesterday, this is our 5th year in a row doing this together. We had a goal of really making this a kind of publishing community event and advanced talk on ethics in publishing. I also want to thank Taylor Dent, who has been our conference assistant. Taylor's a student here at GW Publishing. She's put in a lot of work helping to organize this. Also want to thank once again Jess Hyland, who is the College of Professional Studies event and operations manager. She has put in a lot as well. Many of you met yesterday Cheryl Scott Musone, who is our senior recruiting advisor, and she also put in a lot of work on this. I want to thank all of our presenters from both days. We've had some amazing panels. This has really been, from my perspective, really been wonderful to see so many excellent panels. Thanks to all of our faculty who support our students and support this conference as well. Randy, Pooja, Dean, Ziam, Greg, Britton, so many others. I'm not going to thank every faculty right now in our program. Also, we really have wonderful, fantastic students and alumni, many of whom have presented at this conference. We've heard from Stella, from Steph, from Liliane, from Michaela, from Josephine, from Lois and Haley and Katie and Rachel and Mary Bell. So thanks to all of you. Thanks to everybody who came out both days. I mentioned earlier, kind of in jest, but I really do believe this, set high goals and have low expectations. So everybody set a goal for yourself to take some action on ethical issues in publishing, on one or more, on DEIA, on accessibility, on many other topics, peer review, learn some new skills, contribute to a committee at SSP, AU Presses, at LPC or CSE or ISMTE, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not planning to do a survey about the conference, but I would like to ask you all, and I will send you an email, but I would like to ask you all to send me your thoughts on the conference. Once again, I'll put my email in here. Tell us what you liked about the conference, but also tell us what you think we could do better. Let us know if you'd like to be considered when we have a call for presentations for next year. I also mentioned our student journal symposium that we'll be doing in the spring because it's fun to do not one, but 2 conferences a year. So thanks everybody for coming out and really appreciate the support you've all given us.